Good afternoon, everyone in Europe, and good morning to all those in America. Also, good afternoon to many of you from Africa who are participating in this webinar. I'm delighted to say that there's so many participants this afternoon. You are all very welcome. I'm delighted to be able to introduce this session. I'm Elizabeth Goldberg. I was the Director of Better Regulation in the European Commission for many years. I have been asked to introduce this session by the Italian Regulatory Impact Analysis Observatory, and I would like to thank the Observatory and the European Institute in Florence, as well as George Washington University, for giving us the opportunity to discuss transatlantic regulatory policy this afternoon. So I think that our two speakers need no introduction. They're very well known in the regulatory policy community, but let me introduce them as two eminent scholars, Professor Susan Dudley, who's the director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University. Welcome. She has published regularly and has practical experience as well as the former director of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in Washington. Dr. Claudio Rodelli is well known to all of us. He's a leading expert on European regulatory policy. He taught at the University of Exeter, University College London, and is now at the European Institute in Florence. He's leading a very interesting and exciting research project on effective European governance in Florence. And I have to say that he's inspired many policymakers in all across Europe, not least the European Commission. So, getting into the substance of what we're going to discuss this afternoon, we're looking at regulatory policy developments on both sides of the Atlantic. Certainly, in my experience, I can say that sound regulatory policy is a shared objective of both the European governments and the US administrations, and successive administrations and successive European Commissions have tried to put their stamp on regulatory policy and introduce reforms. So today, Susan will tell us about the Biden administration intentions, their ideas for reforming regulatory policy, if you like, in the US. Unfortunately, the von der Leyen Commission has not yet issued their communication on better regulation, but we are hopeful that it will come soon. And Claudio will discuss today what he thinks should be in that new policy approach. So when both Susan and Claudio are going through their presentations, I think they will touch on topics of sustainable development, innovation. Regulatory budgeting is always a hot topic. Has it worked? Has it not worked? And importantly, I think that they will look at the question of whether regulatory policy approaches are converging on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think we have a very interesting discussion coming up. Just on logistics, our speakers will take 10 to 15 minutes to make their presentations, and then we'll have questions and answers, but there will be questions and answers in writing. So I would ask you to click on your question and answer button, and we will try and take as many questions and answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have. And if we cannot answer them today, we'll come back in writing. So without any further ado, I will give the floor to Susan, and I hope that we all have a very interesting session.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's great to see you virtually, at least, and you, Claudio and Gaia. I want to thank the European University Institute School for Transnational Governance and the Observatory for Regulatory Impact Analysis. The GW Regulatory Studies Center is very happy to be working with you on this. I think this webinar is very timely. So let me start with some brief background that probably won't be new to most people here. The US system of government has 3 branches, and each has a role in issuing, developing, and adjudicating laws. The legislative, executive, and judicial branches each provide checks and balances on the other. And our Constitution also, it's a federalist system, and so state governments also have important authority when it comes to lawmaking. But that doesn't mean that presidential elections aren't important. They are significant events because there's a lot that a president can accomplish unilaterally without the support of the legislative or branch or the courts. And that's especially true when it comes to regulation. Since he took office in January, President Biden has wasted no time in setting the US federal government on a very different path than his predecessor. And given the philosophical differences between ex-President Trump and President Biden, that's probably not surprising to anyone. Biden has issued 37 executive orders, which is significantly more than recent presidents had in their first 2 months. Now, executive orders are directives that presidents can issue without consultation with Congress or the public. They cannot bind the public, but they do guide the executive branch of the government. So on his first day, President Biden was able to reverse, with the stroke of a pen, many of President Trump's executive orders, including the requirement for regulatory offsets or regulatory budgeting that Elizabeth mentioned, the 2-for-1 or 1 in, 2 out order. Also on his first afternoon in office, President Biden issued a memorandum on regulatory review, on modernizing regulatory review. And that's where I want to focus the next 10 minutes of my remarks, because I think that memorandum is probably the best indicator of where the Biden administration is headed on regulation. It signaled both a continuity in some regulatory practices and potentially dramatic shifts in others. So most relevant to probably a lot of people here is that it reaffirmed the basic principles set forth in President Clinton's Executive Order 12866 and President Obama's Executive Order 13563. Note that since presidents can and do cancel out each other's executive orders, it's remarkable that President Clinton's executive order, which he issued in 1993, is still, it's withstood 4 presidents who are very different in their approaches to regulation. And it's lasted now for more than 25 years. And it looks like it will continue to survive. Now, what accounts for that longevity? It was based on bipartisan principles that go back to the 1970s. It's consistent with the good regulatory practices that the EU and the OECD have embraced. And I think it's essential to what we all think about as better regulation. So in particular, it requires agencies to conduct ex-ante impact analysis of regulations, of different approaches to solving a regulatory problem, to quantify the benefits and the costs to the extent possible, but recognizing that it's not always possible to put monetary values or sometimes even to quantify impacts. It directs agencies to try to ensure that the actions they take, that the benefits justify the costs. So in other words, doing more good than harm when you're issuing new regulations. The other part of the executive order that's important is procedural. It provides for executive oversight and coordination of regulation through the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Elizabeth mentioned that in her opening. It's OIRA is what we call it. It's in the Office of Management and Budget, which is in the Executive Office of the President. Now, there are some elements of the Democratic Party in the US that are hostile both to OIRA, executive oversight of regulations, and also the idea of ex-ante impact analysis altogether. So it is significant that President Biden appears to have resisted pressures to abandon those. The memorandum also calls for some changes, specifically revisions to Circular A4, to account for developments in scientific and economic understanding since that was last issued in 2003. So Circular A4 provides detailed guidelines for conducting regulatory analysis. I agree that changes may be in order, but I'm encouraging OIRA and OMB to make modifications judiciously. Its Circular A4 has served as an authoritative source on regulatory analysis throughout the world because it's grounded in theory and empirical evidence rather than prevailing political winds. It was originally drafted in the Clinton administration, so a Democratic presidency, and then it was finalized in the Bush administration, a Republican presidency. So I think any revisions should also follow the process that were followed to issue it in the first place. And that includes peer review and broad public comment, not just focused on particular stakeholders, but broad comment. I've raised some concerns that the focus of some of the recommended revisions in the memorandum appear to be unbalanced. They're targeted at avoiding, quote, harmful anti-regulatory or deregulatory effects without the same attention to harmful effects of potentially excessive or poorly designed regulations. Now, I think that emphasis is probably understandable, and it's a reaction to the previous administration's expressed devotion to reducing regulatory costs, which seem to be at the expense of considering benefits. But despite Trump's rhetoric on that front, OIRA and the agencies continue to examine each individual regulation based on its expected net benefits. And so I suspect that this administration's rhetoric might also be tempered by experience. The memorandum also seeks recommendations for, quote, procedures that take into account the distributional consequences of regulations. That's really important. It's been a part of expressed US policy since at least the 1970s. But regulations, we still don't do it as well as we could, and regulations would benefit from a disciplined, rigorous approach to understanding the potential benefits and burdens of alternative policies on different segments of the population, especially, as President Biden's memorandum notes, disadvantaged, vulnerable, or marginalized communities. Here, I think good regulatory practice calls for transparent, objective, and dispassionate examination of the incidence of both regulatory benefits and costs to understand how alternative approaches to addressing a problem will affect different groups. Regulatory interventions in the economy create opportunities for rent seeking as well-connected groups lobby for policies that benefit a few, while individuals who might be harmed by that policy lack the resources to push back. So a sound approach to distributional effects will be cognizant of those rent-seeking costs and carefully and objectively evaluate both regulatory benefits and costs to avoid well-intentioned policies that can harm vulnerable populations, for example, by reducing employment or impeding other opportunities for improving well-being. One thing that is not emphasized in the memorandum or any of the early actions that I've noticed that I think does deserve attention is better retrospective evaluation of regulatory outcomes. And that's something that I think we can learn more from Europe. I think the pandemic offers all of us some real opportunities there. We've got some natural experiments that we social scientists value so much. We can learn from different responses to the pandemic in the US and different states, different jurisdictions around the globe. Also in the US, and I imagine in Europe and other countries too, we've waived some regulations because of the emergency, and we can learn from that. What was the consequence of that? For example, in the US, the existing rules on telemedicine were set aside in many cases so that virtual consultation with medical providers was allowed. That experience has led to widespread support for perhaps revisiting whether those telemedicine prohibitions make sense. So let me close with some observations on international regulatory cooperation. When I was administrator of OIRA in the Bush administration, there was significant attention to improving international regulatory cooperation. It's how I first met Elizabeth. We focused on agreements on regulatory procedures, ex-ante procedures to improve harmonization of outcomes, including how do we do impact analysis? How do we do public consultation? Also on sharing of information, including underlying scientific information as we were developing regulations, but also evidence of potential hazards in international commerce, misbranded or adulterated products. We also talked a lot about, are there ways that we could do more mutual recognition of each other's standards, even when they're different? So the objective there is that we respect different jurisdictional authorities and preferences and approaches, but we want to make sure that regulations don't needlessly interfere with international trade and investment. So my sense is that the Trump administration was much less interested in these, and that those cooperative efforts were kind of put on the back burner for the last 4 years. And I think I'm excited about opportunities to reinvigorate those. And I hope this discussion today is a harbinger of that and of better regulation to come. And with that, I guess I'll hand it back to Elizabeth or directly to Professor Radielli.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I will talk about the European Union and within the EU, the strategy of the European Commission, with the caveat that we haven't seen as yet a communication on better regulation of this European Commission. But as it is often the case, it's useful to go back in time a tiny bit and see where we are, what has changed, what has not changed, and what the communication should say, and then we can, if you wish, also talk about what we will probably read and not read, but that's more looking into the proverbial crystal ball. So going back a tiny bit, we have to go back at least to 2015, when the Commission relaunched the better regulation strategy, binding later also the Parliament and the Council in an intergovernmental agreement on better lawmaking. At that time, Timmermans had this vision of closing the policy cycle by connecting a retrospective review of regulations to the work on impact assessment of new legislation and consultation. The Commission did a review of the better regulation policy in 2019. That was very, very favorable. Of course, it was carried out by the European Commission itself with many interviews with the officers. Interestingly, in 2018, the OECD published data on better regulation policies in its member states and the EU, and the policies on impact assessment, stakeholders engagement, and to some extent exposed to regulatory review of the EU, were on average, and in many cases, outperforming the ones of the member states. So we got into the end of 2019, when von der Leyen was appointed president of the Commission, with no big feelings that this policy was needing an overhaul or was doing anything bad. It was considered a good practice. And the Commission started with a mandate that included, as a working method, an obligation to carry out a kind of regulatory offsetting, one in, one out. And we can talk about the details of this type of offsetting. It was later specified by the Council that should not be detrimental to ecological or social objectives. The working method of the Commission is the orthodoxy, is a 5-page document that really defines what's important in the working methods of the Commission. And to see something about better regulation there where was a novelty. To see one in, one out there was a kind of big signal to those of us who study regulation and to stakeholders. Okay, so the scene was set for this kind of better regulation policy when everything kind of changed with the pandemic and now with the recovery plans. But one thing has not changed, which is the core of better regulation as strategy. That means proportionality, evidence-informed assessments, a transparent balancing act between cost and benefits, open trade-offs between different types of risks, stakeholders engagement, and in the case of the Commission, also evaluate first before you start. So these principles are at a level that I would say goes above the tools, and they have not changed, and they're still very important. But what has changed actually is more in the priorities of the Commission. The Commission has now priorities to produce a Green Deal, a climate strategy, which is very ambitious, an economy that works for the people, which is a very political priority, a Europe fit for the digital age, protecting the European way of life, and more recently, the Next Generation EU Recovery Plan. So these priorities go beyond, if you think about it, the effects of the pandemic. They are big political priorities. And for me, they have two initial implications. One is that in this context, one in, one out as a principle of regulatory review is narrow. Obviously, you don't go into these priorities with a centerpiece that is very much about limiting or reducing administrative burdens. That's only one component of the total costs. It doesn't include compliance costs, and is not balanced with the benefits. You see that all the priorities of the Commission I mentioned earlier on are benefits oriented instead. The second implication is that when you really want to start, as the Commission does, with evaluating first before you regulate, then the retrospective review of existing regulations should be much, much more future-oriented. Up until recently, the mantra of the Commission was to evaluate rules and see whether they are fit for purpose. And now the implication is that you should look at whether they are fit for purpose. And the Commission changed the name of the platform that does this kind of exercise. We have to see whether the tasks and operational activity will also be in this direction, or like it was until recently, oriented yet again to the elimination of administrative burdens. So in light of that, what should the Commission say? Well, I would say that better regulation principles, the ones I mentioned before, transparency, balancing acts, evidence-based policy, should underpin these political priorities rather than the political priorities pigeonholing better regulation as a consequence of that. So in a sense, better regulation as a strategy, as a set of principles, should be there to see how to achieve, the Europe that works for the people, the Green Deal, and the digital single market regulations that are coming out on artificial intelligence, and etc. The principles are good to appraise the big strategies of the Commission. Secondly, every effort, and here I relate to what Susan was saying, should be made to avoid benefit neglect. This is a very important issue. In a sense, the Commission, I think, should move the attention, given their political priorities, from administrative burdens and costs, not to ignore the cost, but to balance the cost with the benefits that are expected from the political priorities. In the way I read the priorities of the Commission, boils down to issues such as gender, human dignity, social inclusion, and role of new generations. Okay, if you wish, the sustainable development goals. I think then that the new better regulation policy consistent with these should have a kind of do no significant harm test for these issue areas. So whenever a regulation is considered, the Commission should raise the question, does it do significant harm to gender, to dignity, to diversity, to social inclusion, to sustainability and the next generations? This is a way to apply, I think, now better regulation to the ambitious priorities of the Commission. And thirdly, as I said, and I finish on this, the big role of innovation, which has become extremely important in Europe, together with foresight that has been included as an important dimension also of regulatory oversight. The regulatory scrutiny body of the Commission is now bound also to review the foresight dimension of regulations under discussion. Obviously, the Commission is thinking about regulatory flexibility, like Susan was saying. We have to appreciate that this will happen in Europe in a very, very different context of legal systems, where regulatory flexibility is understood very differently in Dublin, in Paris, and then in Luxembourg by the European Court of Justice. What may look like negotiating regulation in one country, it doesn't look the same in the European Court of Justice. So this flexibility filters down in very different types of legal context. And secondly, on innovation, better regulation is still there to, I would say, test all the assumptions about innovation that the big priorities of the Commission implicitly make. For example, the farm to fork strategy of the Commission claims that 20% of agriculture will be organic. Great. Is this true? Is it not true? We have the better regulation tools to appraise them. Those should not be political objectives, but themselves can be tested with impact assessment, with regulatory analysis. When we say that small and medium enterprises will lead the transition, that's another hypothesis that should not come before we apply better regulation, but itself tested with the tools of regulatory analysis. The Commission also at the level of priorities, and I'll finish on that, says that innovation has to be radical, should not be incremental. Well, I would say, as someone who looks at regulatory analysis, that depends on the sectors. It's very much another hypothesis to be tested. It can be just a political priority that goes untested, and then better regulation is applied to a lower level type of analysis. So I think on innovation, we have a lot of promise. I very much hope the Commission on the communication will talk about it, but it's not clear how exactly that can create a more kind of Europeanized context with the Commission and the member states on the same wavelength in terms of innovation. Thank you.
Oh, I would like to thank both speakers very much. And now we can turn to the questions, and I will have a look at the questions and ask here two questions for Professor Dudley. What's the right balance between technical and distributional issues in the OIRA analysis? Susan, do you want to take that one on?
Sure, and I saw that came from Sarah. So hi, Sarah. Nice to know that you're there. I think that the distributional should itself be technical. So what I think might be an ideal, and I'm actually at the Regulatory Studies Center, we actually have a project where we want to try to think about how to do this well. And so my initial thinking is, if we can look at the benefits and costs, so apply it technically to different population groups and understand that even a regulation that on average may have very large net benefits, if the burdens are borne by vulnerable populations and the benefits are received by not vulnerable, that's not a good public policy. And so to try to the extent that we can, look at regulations, look at different alternatives, and see how they affect different populations. So almost a regulatory impact analysis by type of population. I'm not sure if so it's not an either or, Sarah, but it's apply technical analysis, but think about it through that distributional lens.
Thank you very much, Susan. I don't know, Claudio, if you have anything to say about distributional analysis. I think for years the Commission has included recommendations to do distributional analysis in its toolbox. I don't know if you have any comments on how well the Commission has succeeded in its impact assessments in looking at distributional effects.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I would put it under the label guidance versus practice. The European Commission provides extensive guidance in the toolbox. Toolbox runs for, I think, 480 pages, and so it's something at the beginning and the inception says the officers of the Commission should read the toolbox, and there you'll find pretty much everything, including innovation. And the only thing is gender is lumped up with wider social distributional issues. So there is not a specific guidance on gender impact assessment. On distribution, I think the issue is that when you have this level of detail in the toolbox, which is not by itself bad guidance, then you have to transfer that into practice, right? Because otherwise it's too much of a long shopping list. And it's indicative that the introductory page says you should read, so you should use, right? You should master this toolbox. And obviously no one can master hundreds and hundreds of pages. So the devil is a bit in the details. I think there a big role comes also from the regulatory scrutiny body, which is a very serious regulatory oversight body of the Commission. I expect from them more and more kind of soft jurisprudence, maybe not circular A4, but some guidance notes, some memorandum on, for example, how to carry out distributional analysis, so that then the DGs, the Directorate-General of the Commission, who want or consider doing, and some do, distributional analysis, know exactly what is expected by the review body. Otherwise, the tool number, let's say 62, becomes very much a guidance with a limited practice. Having said that, some DGs, you may imagine which ones are stronger than others in carrying out this distributional analysis. I think it's also time to see more guidance and practice on gender impact assessment.
Thank you. Going on to, we're getting many questions now. There seem to be a number of questions here about protecting the planet, prosperity, the Green Deal, what policies on the ground to ensure that Africa participates as well in the climate change agenda. I guess one of the things that we would need to look at, again, similar to distributional analysis, is how sustainable development has been taken into account, how climate change will be taken into account, and also if you look at the Green Deal, for example, how do we balance the necessity for regulation against the ever persistent threat of having over-regulation? So I asked both of them.
Shall I start, because the Green Deal is European, and yeah, I guess the same balancing acts occur in the US. And here, maybe I'll take a moment to also answer the question by Alessandro Sica on the member states, which is appropriate. Yeah, I think there is a question about policy and politics. Politically, the Commission announces the Green Deal with all the targets. At the moment, we don't see a lot of better regulation strategies and tools applied to the Green Deal as such. Then the Green Deal filters down into a number of regulations and directives that are themselves impact assessed and reviewed by the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. Obviously, the Regulatory Scrutiny Board can only look at what is done as, let's say, an evaluation or an impact assessment, and it cannot say the Green Deal does not pass a benefit cost test, obviously, because it's a political priority, but perhaps when we think about the Green Deal, it would be legitimate to ask about a kind of a better regulation, systematic understanding of all the trade-offs and balancing acts, and whether industry is prepared or should be made prepared without making too many assumptions, and being as empirical as possible on this. Otherwise, political priorities without any kind of better regulation or regulatory analysis thinking are very difficult to be appraised, understood, and have a kind of early alert on what the trade-offs are and how they can be balanced. Alessandro also has a great question about the fact that the EU level can be somewhat compared to the federal level, but that much of the directives are transposed with a degree of flexibility by the member states. So it's different when we compare, for example, a rule set by Environmental Protection Agency and the directive of the European Commission. And here we don't see the member states always doing the same. And they may have the same language, but obviously is not a tightly integrated system of regulatory appraisal across all the stages of preparing, transposing, implementing, enforcing rules. If you are then on the ground as a company, what matters then the rule that is delivered, and that rule contains all the steps that I mentioned earlier on. And this is obviously the way the EU is, and more attention should be dedicated, and probably we can hope the communication will do to the integration between the EU level and the member states, because this is a joint responsibility and can be joint success or joint failure depending on how things go.
Yeah, I agree with Claudia on the similarities and differences between the federal government and the states in the US and the EU and the member states. There are similarities, but it is really different too. My background is economics, and so I approach problems like climate change and through an economics perspective. And I think what we really need to do this well, because it is a global problem that we need to do globally, is through pricing. So I think the best way to go forward would be to agree on what is the social cost of carbon, and agree on how we're going to incorporate that into all our analysis, whether it's through a tax, which I think most economists would say that's the best way to do it, is tax carbon when it's removed from the ground, and perhaps find ways to rebate if you have solutions. But I think it doesn't have to be that, but agreeing on what the social cost of carbon is, that allows us then to incorporate it into our different analyses, our benefit cost analyses. And this relates to somebody else. There was a question in there kind of generally about how do you deal with benefits that are harder to quantify. I do think climate is probably the biggest challenge that we face, and it's something that we face together as a world rather than each individual nation. And even if we don't get the price right, starting with the price is definitely the right step.
Thank you to both of you. I see that there are a couple of questions, including one from Jonathan Weiner, Professor Weiner from Duke University, about US-EU regulatory cooperation. Another question about TTIP. Now, in the TTIP negotiations, which I was certainly involved with, and Susan perhaps on the margins advising, we made quite a bit of progress, but as everyone knows, the negotiations were suspended. And so the question is there sufficient grounds to relaunch regulatory cooperation initiatives? And the question from Professor Weiner is, if so, in what areas, what steps should we take? maybe Susan, you could take the first stab at answering that question.
Well, actually, I think what you, Elizabeth, and Jonathan would have to say are probably much more informed than what I would have to say. You two are both experts in that area. I think that's right. I think some of the things that we were working on, so now for me, it's more than 12 years ago that I was working on this, was there are some things that we just do differently, and there was no way that we were going to reach agreement on them because we just did them our own ways. And so I would say, let's try to set those aside and be more forward looking. So that was an emphasis part of what we were doing with the EU-US Regulatory Cooperation Forum. But there was one other thought that I had. Oh, the other thing I think is perhaps, and this is where I think you and Jonathan probably, and probably Claudio too, have thoughts, individual regulatory agencies across the Atlantic and in other countries. I think some more bilateral or multilateral discussions rather than at the big TTIP level, but more at that level on particular products or problems, that may be a path forward. And then again, I'll come back to my, agreeing on a social cost of carbon could be huge.
I agree, and for many years I thought there was no point in seeing these meetings between the US and the EU officers in charge of regulatory analysis, stating the differences and trying to explain passionately to the other, with models, with graphs, these are, yes, and these are we do, but they are, I would think, institutionally and organizationally different. So they're not the same. They are underpinned, broadly speaking, by the same strategy, yes. But then the tools, the levels, the multi-level system of one or the other, the level of federalization of the regulatory systems differ. And these differences should, in a sense, not come as in a way to obfuscate how we may label the same thing consultation, but it's a bit different. We may label impact assessment and just look at what is done. Like Susan, I think that the regulatory agencies of the European Commission, of the EU actually, are more similar to the ones of the US, and then that's where a tighter dialogue can productively be developed. There is another thing that no matter how things are done differently, you can also look at the substance of what comes out. And obviously, whether you do regulatory analysis one way or the other, if you can conclude, for example, that in one system, there is a huge benefit neglect, and in the other there is not, then the rules will be very different, because there is the philosophy of regulatory analysis underpinning the two differs. On this, at least on paper, the two systems may come together, so they kind of producing the same type of regulatory analysis in different ways, or at least more consistent in terms of the regulatory philosophy. For this, it would be useful to see the communication of the Commission. As I said, I don't think the Commission needs to overhaul and backtrack on what was done before, but the circumstances have changed. The fact that the new communication was announced at least 4 times and delayed, if we want to be optimistic, it's because it's getting better and better. Let's hope that's the case.
One more thought. Do you mind, Elizabeth, if I just comment a little bit more? And this is more a question, I think, is what are there opportunities for mutual recognition? I'm following along what Claudio was saying, that we may reach different outcomes through different processes, but certainly we can recognize that the other system works. And perhaps this is an opportunity for the retrospective evaluation, is in doing our retrospective evaluation, can we learn about what works and doesn't, and be more willing to recognize each other's products and outcomes of regulations to enable trade and investment?
Well, if I can just contribute from experience I had in over the last year was looking at mutual recognition in the pharmaceutical sector. And there, an agreement was signed in 1998, and it took a long time to get off the ground. But now it's actually working. And of course, it went through many phases. But I think there you see that where there is a will and incentive on both sides of the Atlantic, that there certainly are possibilities for working together. And another agreement, which always comes to mind, is the aircraft agreement. If the approvals on both sides of the Atlantic of aircraft can take place and planes continue to fly safely, obviously that it has had its advantages there. So I think there are many opportunities there. I think it's a question of, like many things, people having the trust, working together, the confidence of working together, and enough similarity, if you like, in policy orientations and in to make a go of mutual recognition. So it's just a bit of a comment I have that that in the pharmaceutical sector it seems to be working quite well. For I should clarify, for good manufacturing practices. It's not automatic recognition of users' authorizations on both sides of the Atlantic. So just to go on to question, perhaps there's a question on innovation and how artificial intelligence and big data analysis will be shaping assessments and regulatory policy in the future. Claudio, maybe you want to take that one on in your effective governance governance hat.
There is a debate on smartening regulatory impact analysis with artificial intelligence. And obviously, yeah, if you are someone looking at IA and then you turn and look at impact assessment, it looks like the one is way ahead of the other. There are opportunities to scale up the quality of impact assessments by using artificial intelligence. However, at the level then of the policy appraisal, you still have this, the good old trade-offs and balancing acts that between paternalism and freedom, between insights from behavioral economics and then scaling up experiments to a different level. Certainly, one thing that could be done is to smarten RIAs by consolidating all these numbers that are produced one IA after the other, all this assessment of cost, often in sectors that are not too different from the others. But then each IA starts from scratch. And so we don't have, I think, like as researchers, when we do research, we have to send our data to a repository that then other researchers can use if they see fit, as for example, to create confidence intervals or orders of magnitude or sensitivity analysis. That would be one way. I think that the Commission has not been very keen on behavioral economics. It's not been hostile, but not. It's been a kind of more cautious in relation to behavioral economics in impact assessment. Artificial intelligence is there in a moment where the Commission is regulating artificial intelligence with its own regulation. So in a sense, is a two-way street between IA and RIA, and then the RIA of IA. And that's a kind of moment where some of the issues are up in the air, and that we then settle down in a year or two, and only time will tell what the equilibrium is between the two.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add to that. Thank you, Claudio.
We have a question about externalities and developing countries, and a question of how are both on the US side and Europe taking in externalities in their assessments. And I suppose the broader question is, how are international impacts, whether they're trade or otherwise, taken into account in the either impact assessment ex ante or the evaluations ex post?
There's certainly, you know, there are directives in the US to consider international impacts when analyzing ex ante, analyzing regulations. I think it's probably done occasionally and not extensively. So I think that probably is something, and I think there are probably real positive externalities as well as negative externalities that should be taken into account.
Yeah, this is one of the two things where I think the Commission could do with a nice memorandum. One, it would be great to see one on scientific integrity after the pandemic, like the ones that the Biden-Harris administration has produced. I think we would benefit from that. And the other is on international impact. I also see there is a question about Africa. So at the level of bigger policy priorities, all this is considered and enshrined in the policy documents. But here we are at a more granular level of whether this happens at the level of individual regulations, directives, and more generally policies of the Commission. I think this is a big question that could be used to go through all the political priorities of the Commission when we say things about the innovation should be radical and not incremental, that we should have a farm to fork strategy, the climate change. All of that is inherently contingent on an international dimension, because I think in the end, if you think about the recovery, for example, the assumption is that Europe will still and become even more attractive to foreign direct investment and international trade in general. So you cannot say we want to become, you know, the cleanest and greenest economy in the world without this. Hey, what is the position then of foreign direct investment? This what is the difference that is going to make, plus or minus in terms of crude regulatory analysis features? So this is something that it's even more important at the level of these big political priorities than at the level of individual impact assessment. But clearly, most of the key priorities are contingent on an analysis of this kind of externalities. Whether it's done or not, I think is in the self-interest of the European Commission, and to be precise, then the European Parliament and the Council, when they finalize policy, look at the amendments to consider that amendments and last-minute agreements in Council may tilt the scale in one direction or the other. So in a sense, I go back to do no significant harm also to, if you value international trade, if you value foreign direct investment, if you value externalities, do no significant harm to these dimensions when you deal with green climate, agriculture, etc.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I see that there are a few questions on follow-up, or shall we say the implications of the pandemic, and what you touched on this briefly, Susan, what lessons can be learned coming out of the pandemic, what impact essentially the pandemic has on the way we look at regulatory policy in both narrow and broader sense.
Well, as I mentioned, I think that there are some natural experiments which we can use retrospective evaluation to see how different things worked. For example, I think in the US, the Food and Drug Administration loosened some of its standards for approving new pharmaceuticals, which led to the rapid development and dissemination of these vaccines. I'm fully vaccinated now, so which is very exciting. So I think those are the kinds of things, and that's another example of a positive externality worldwide. If as developed nations, if we can do that and then get the vaccines approved and then help distribute them internationally. I think those are worldwide benefits. So I think there's a lot. I'm not sure I have other specific examples, but, and it'll be certainly for the next several years, we'll be looking back at the pandemic and seeing what we've learned. One thing is that we can do these wonderful meetings without Claudio inviting me to Italy to get to be doing it and looking out at his beautiful trees.
Well, yes, I'm. I look forward to showing you the trees and the hills that I can see from the office. One lesson is risk analysis, right? Foundational principle. You can say schools are closed, but mom and dad go to work if then the children stay with the grandfather and grandmother, because that creates the preconditions for more contagion and diffusion of the virus. So risk analysis. Number two, pandemic for me brings public health benefits. Administrative burdens, honestly, are not the most important thing. If we think big, if you think about recovery, if you think about a new approach to public health, if you think that the EU before the pandemic did not have a regulatory competence, and now is I'm not saying it has now, but it is somewhat emerging. So when the Commission talks about green passports for those with the vaccine, hey, that should be impact assessed as well, right? It cannot be just a lesson from the pandemic without the impact assessment. So that's another important lesson from the pandemic. Elizabeth, can I take on this, on medicines, the question from Marina Cino Pagliarella, because it's another one by Alberto Bitonti on the political pressures. I think, Susan, I hope you think the same, that we have two dimensions of carrying out a regulatory analysis and then the usages of regulatory analysis. We don't do regulatory analysis to avoid political pressures. No, we do regulatory analysis so that then there has been a space for evidence-informed and value-balanced political decisions. So the regulatory review, for example, of the RSB is strong on whether there is enough evidence to justify a proposal. It should not be concerned, and is not, to the best of my knowledge, concerned with is this a political suitable proposal or not. And if you keep the two dimensions distinct, we appreciate the limited but extraordinary value of regulatory analysis. If we mix the two, then we get in too much confusion, which has been debated at length in the US literature.
Susan, go ahead.
I don't know if that's a good way to close, but I think that's very important. I'm a big believer in regulatory analysis and laying out the evidence and understanding the trade-offs of different alternative approaches to achieving policy goals. But I agree 100% that that's what it is. It's evidence that informs political decisions, because there's still a role for political decisions that are transparent. Here's why we decided what we did. And better to do that based on it, have evidence available, even if the political decision maker says, I'm going to go a different path for other reasons. And that's fine with me.
Well, we certainly have many more questions coming in, and I'm afraid we don't have many more minutes left, but I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank both Susan and Claudio for a very interesting discussion. I think that the level of interest shows that perhaps the Institute should do a follow-up seminar so that we can continue to discuss these matters. I think that it's very encouraging to see this level of interest. And I would just like to say to the audience that apologize for any questions that we've not been able to answer. And the Institute will get back to you over the next little while with the answer to the questions that could not be answered in person, virtually online. So for everyone, thank you very much. And hopefully, unless my two speakers have any final comments they want to make, we can say we will try and see each other virtually soon.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth and Claudio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And goodbye.
Bye-bye.